Welcome back to the short series introducing the Aramaic language. Today we're going to be looking at Aramaic as a Northwest Semitic language. So what do we mean by Aramaic as a Northwest Semitic language? Well, if we look at the map here, we have it coded in different colors. Basically, the blue is sort of the coastal or the Canaanite, and this isn't exact. I may make this a little differently next time. The lavender purplish in the center is kind of the long extent of Aramaic. And then as you get more toward the reddish color to the right, you have Akkadian, and below to the south, you have Arabic. So Aramaic is situated somewhere in the middle of all of these. Okay. It's Aramaic in the center. Now it looks like a really big swath of land. And I guess by land size, it is. But the thing is, if you remember from your early education classes and learning about the Fertile Crescent, the portion that's listed as Aramaic is largely empty, and it really straddles the top, the left side, the top, and then down the Euphrates River toward the right and into Mesopotamia. And so there's different times and periods where Aramaic is popular in those regions. It tends to be popular in the ancient world in the top portion and the left portion of the Fertile Crescent. Now, we can think of Aramaic by period, and that's often how it's classified. And there's a number of ways that it's classified. I mean, you may read something online, and it may reflect, one of the more popular ways of doing it. And there's different reasons for different scholars to classify Aramaic, according to different systems. But one thing we can say is that ancient Aramaic goes back to about the 9th century BC when it's written. And there's a number of inscriptions that follow from there. I mean, we know it's probably in use and operational before this period. But what remains? The things that are going to survive time, well, they might be stone inscriptions. So we have one called the Barakib and the Tel Fakhariya inscription here, or the Stela of Guzan. And then to the right, we have a letter that was actually found in Egypt. And this is from a site called Elephantine. And there's a series of letters written in Aramaic that survived. Why did they survive in Egypt? Well, they're written on papyrus. And papyrus is made from reeds, a certain type of plant. And Egypt is very, very dry, right? Like, why do things survive the test of time in Egypt, but maybe not like in South India, right? Or the Amazon, or even the North, right? Where there's a lot of rain, things that are going to survive are going to be things that are, made of stone, or things that are going to resist the forces of nature. So we have ancient Aramaic, and then it's followed by a number of later Aramaic dialects. This is kind of the common classical or traditional, I guess I should say, organization. They'd like to organize it in terms of East and West Aramaic. That's largely geographical. If you look at some of these names, you'll see kind of Palestinian Christian, Palestinian Jewish. This refers to the region in the period. Then Palmyra and the Nabatean kingdoms of Jordan, Samaritan, again, is in the Holy Land. And so a lot of these, and if you look at the modern dialects there, those are towns in Syria. Well, if you look at East Aramaic, you have in the north Syriac. Where does Syriac come from? It comes from a town called Edessa. You can look it up. It's in south central Turkey. Then we have modern dialects that come. Then we have southern dialects that are basically reflected, in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. So going back in time, we see Aramaic's really old. It's a very old language, and it has a long history. And it's not one of those things that just sort of stops. I mean, it continues on into the classical era, right? And so we have with Aramaic. And so we have Aramaic really lasting, not just from the far ancient days to the classical, antique, late antiquity, medieval period. But Aramaic survives today. It's a spoken language today. And, I mean, I'm immersed in several communities that speak it. And this is it functions as a liturgical language for different churches from the Middle East, but more importantly, communities still speak this language. So when it comes to modern Aramaic, there's basically two dialects, or maybe strands, I could say. There are variations of a similar name, Surite or Turoyo, which is, the Western version of Neo-Aramaic. And then there is the Northeastern Neo-Aramaic tradition, or Sureth, modern Assyrian, as it's often called. It's really, the modern Assyrian is an umbrella term for a number of dialects. I mean, these dialects span, a pretty wide region, and they border at least 3 countries historically, a little bit of 4, but not much in Syria proper, but Turkey, Iraq, and Iran have a number of Nina or Sureth dialects. And in the last century, many people were displaced from places like Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, and they settled in Syria along the Khabur River. And so Aramaic thrived there until the last, decade or so, in the unfortunate tragedies of the war going on there. And so Aramaic has been alive for 3,000 years at least. And it's a living language that shows a lot of growth, right? So the ancient forms aren't always the same as the modern forms. And there's a lot of mixing with terms from different peoples and different places. And that goes as far back as Biblical Aramaic. And Biblical Aramaic has a lot of Akkadian and Persian words in it. And rightfully so. I mean, we would expect that. That's kind of the context of the stories anyway. So we see that again with Syriac. More words are coming in from foreign places. And then, in modern dialects, depending on what side of a border someone lives, they may use more Turkish words or Persian words or Arabic words, or even Kurdish words that integrate into the language. But it's not just that. There's also different forms that happen. And so when students study Aramaic these days, they don't study modern, even though, it kind of makes sense to do a modern along with an ancient. Maybe that's because there's enough difference that it could kind of be like the way we do English today, as opposed to Old English. There really is that much of a difference along the way between Old and modern Aramaic dialects. So what do people study? They study Biblical Aramaic and Syriac, okay? And if you're watching this video, you're probably taking one of those courses right now, and we're sort of locating our Aramaic in that context. Now, just for fun, I'm looking at a comparison. I'm looking at a comparison at a number of Aramaic terms here. The languages are very similar. Some verbal forms are different. So looking at these dialects, just look at the pronoun, first person, first common singular pronoun, I, right? So in Old Aramaic, you have Anaki, or Anoki maybe, but probably Anoki with a long A. Or we have Ana, and Ana persists into Biblical Aramaic. Something similar in Syriac, it's spelled a little differently. Instead of a hey at the end, it's spelled with an aleph. So we have Ena or Eno. And in the modern dialects, we have Ana or Ono in the modern dialects. If we want to say of, in Old Aramaic, we'll see it written as Z. In Biblical Aramaic, we'll see it written as D, and Syriac as da, and in the modern Northeastern Neo-Aramaic as id or the, depending on the accent of the village. A lot of times people will append it to a word before the word that it's joined to, rather than the traditional way of saying of blank, right? Of blank means something belongs to the noun, right? And so usually it comes before the noun, but in some modern dialects, they'll just append it to the previous word the way their accent is. Now, it's interesting, we see this Z and D shift, and we know about the Beged Kefet rules. And so in Syriac Aramaic, we often have D or Dalet represented as the rather than just the. And again, it depends on the rules that or the habits of how people speak. And so that also indicates to us that this word the might be the original sound behind it, because the can shift to z or d. The can shift to z or d. Looking at the word king, we have malka or malko, and then malka or malko. Basically, it's the same. And really, the difference is the older versions of Aramaic use the absolute forms more than the emphatic forms, which, biblical Aramaic is kind of 50-50. Syriac is kind of like 95-5 when it comes to emphatic forms versus absolute forms. And that's the case with modern Aramaic too. Really, it's just the emphatic forms that are used in modern Aramaic. The verbs can be different, right? And in old Aramaic inscriptions, when we say old Aramaic too, like we're just measuring it from the inscriptions that are left. And so we see, the way that it's written, could be with this long vowel wow in the middle, yamut. That's basically the same in biblical Aramaic. Sometimes it can be written without that in older Aramaic. In Syriac, we don't see the yod for the third person masculine singular when it comes to the imperfect form. We see a nun. And then when we get to Northeastern Neo-Aramaic, we have a very different form, bidmayith, where we have this particle on the front. We use a participle basically to express the verb. So there you have it. Aramaic is a Northwest Semitic language. In some cases, Aramaic is kind of a blanket term like English, where we have all sorts of different dialects of English, and then we have different ways of speaking over time, right? That whenever we speak, languages develop, right? That's always something that's going to happen. And so there is a lot of variance, but at its core, it's pretty intelligible. So if you're taking biblical Aramaic right now, Syriac may not be too difficult for you. If you're taking Syriac right now, biblical Aramaic may not be too difficult for you. In fact, I was speaking today to a monk who grew up, speaking Syriac, and once he learned to read the alphabet in biblical Aramaic, you get the hang of it, because it's effectively the same language, and you're reading different spellings with things. You're going to have different words here or there, and then you can start to figure out the forms. Check out my video comparing biblical Aramaic and Syriac if you're curious about that. So if you're studying one of these major languages, consider studying the other, and then think about Aramaic in its Northwest Semitic context, because now you're going to have tools to interface with Hebrew, with Phoenician, with all the other different dialects that we have little glimpses of, like Ammonite and Moabite and things like that. So that's it for this evening. Fushun Bashlomo, Pushun Bashlama, and we'll see you next time.